was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out. People on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side. And they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. When the orange people broke the fast, the field was waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers... He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out. People on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side. And they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. When the oranges broke thick and fast, the field was waving corn. And Stalin is the farmer, his fingers... He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga. And we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they're ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way. So Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.
주체의 사회주의를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계를 우리 어떻게
And here to do this with me is the man who brought you such hits as Paul Mason is an MI6 rat and others. And Paul, of course, I don't know if you saw this, Kit. Paul has been all over the news again this weekend, all over the internet, leading, or I think playing a big part in the Ukraine so-called solidarity demo held in London, where every single what I'm going to call social chauvinist rat in British politics was there, from Paul Mason to John McDonnell to representatives, of course, of the Trade Union Congress and Plaid Cymru and the SNP. All coming together in one vast assemblage, well, quite small assemblage of scumbags to declare that the war must continue and that they all back Keir Starmer from the left, of course. But I did an hour-long ranting and raving about this last night, but I did want to offer you the opportunity to pass any comment you saw fit on such a assemblage of miserable, low-rent traitors.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's hardly surprising, and I think, as you have said, it's quite remarkable the extent to which Britain, there is, at least in mainstream terms, complete unanimity between every single political party, between every single media outlet, that this war should continue. It must continue. Aside from, yes, a clip that we played last week, which sadly people on the live stream didn't catch because of audio issues, it was some anti-woke right-wing activist who was actually trying to make the case against George Monbiot for why the war shouldn't continue. Monbiot's prescription was literally, well, let's just keep going. I mean, so this is hardly surprising. That said, I have seen recently, I think it might have been in the past couple of days, The Guardian published an op-ed by a member of a crossbench peer in the House of Lords, who was saying, well, look, we need to get realistic about this and accept the fact that we're not going to be able to help Ukraine get its territory back, and we need a negotiated settlement. And the longer this goes on, the more dangerous, the more draining, the more destructive this is going to be for everyone involved. Kind of an unthinkable perspective for the British media to amplify for the past 3 years. So maybe that's a sign of progress. But equally, this is just one voice drowned out by the Chicken Little chorus of scum on the British intelligence payroll, like Paul Mason. So we shall, and there is zero indication amongst Britain's political elite that there is any inclination towards a negotiated settlement, despite some major political ruptures, which we'll dive into. We're going to approach the events buffet with a very big plate this week.
Indeed. We will be using a longer and bigger spoon than the one that Stalin used to eat all the grain in Ukraine in the early 1930s. Now, that's a reference to Holodomor mythology. If you dear viewers are not familiar with it, be sure to look it up. For those who missed the clips in the audio from last week, that has been resolved in the audio-only version, which is now out on Spotify. So for those of you who missed that on live due to technical problems, you can now find that on Spotify. So be sure to look that up. It will be publicized on our Substack account and social media channels. So moving then, Kit, into our first particular story for today. That is, of course, the ongoing, shall we say, wild hysteria over whatever it is that Trump and the Trump administration think they're doing or are doing with regards to the negotiations with Russia. And that is, of course, that Zelensky is now finding his position distinctly, I would say, under threat and threat of expiration. He has been making all kinds of statements going back and forth about from between defiance and potential capitulation. There was a story last week about him signing a deal with the UAE to basically transport money out of Ukraine. So it looks as if he's preparing for some sort of exit, but he's now saying he's willing to step down in return for peace and immediate NATO membership and immediate EU membership. By the way, as we've said before, NATO membership wouldn't even have been on the cards if Biden had run again and won. It was never meant to be. So this is a completely unlikely scenario. But your response to Zelensky's wild week, Kit?
Oh, well, I mean, it's been pretty extraordinary, and I think that and what's quite funny is I just think that there is a mass delusion amongst Ukrainian ultras, and I think it's part of the kind of grieving and acceptance process that they're in a state of total denial. Like, the writing is on the wall. There have been all of these very, very negative reports about Zelensky. I mean, at least reflecting the Trump administration's position on the soon-to-be former Ukrainian president, where it's quite clear that they don't don't take him seriously. They to an extent blame him for this war happening in the first place, and his time is well and truly over. And I think, I mean, yes, I'm willing to step down if it means NATO membership. Well, I mean, you could be cooed, helicoptered to London, or God knows what else in the next few weeks, based on the on and off record emanations of Trump administration officials. Now, if I think that what's really remarkable as well is that despite this kind of vast negative wall of noise that in the media about how Trump doesn't like Zelensky, he doesn't trust him, he thinks that Ukraine is a busted flush, he doesn't want to send them any more aid. The Ukrainians are apparently not listening, or think that this is somehow jockeying for position and he might be playing games with them for political reasons. Because and I think that there are some interesting parallels in this with the end of, and I've written about this I wrote about this for Mint Press 18 months ago. I wrote about how there was an official report into the collapse of the Afghan government published in the US, which found that numerous State Department officials consulted for this review stated that they openly told their puppet Ghani in Afghanistan that we are leaving and we're not coming back, and you are going to be on your own, mate. And Ghani didn't believe them, because he thought, well, they've expended so much blood and treasure trying to hold on to this highly geopolitically significant bit of real estate over 20 years. There's no way they're just going to pull out and vanish. So he didn't believe them, and he thought that they were, trying to play games with him, trying to get concessions out of him and whatnot. No, they were being literally forthright, and they were going to leave and in totality and never come back. And it was that I think that similar conversations may well have been had with the Ukrainians behind closed doors now, and it's not getting through. So, I mean, I think particularly if you look at the deal that's now been signed between the US and Ukraine. The way it's been reported is really interesting. If you draw up the Financial Times article, is that so effectively Russia has already stated to the US, and we'll get into this in due course, that they are willing to offer Ukrainian quote unquote resources and minerals and rare earths and whatnot that in territory they control, that became Ukraine after 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union. Zelensky has indicated a willingness to do the same, and he has assigned a formal deal which offers Ukraine zero security guarantees or much in the way of anything. Apart from there will be a portion of that wealth stripped out that will be used for Ukraine's reconstruction. The details of how much that is are not clear. And I might add that I've seen several Ukrainian ultras, including Ukrainian government ministers, who have tried to finesse this and have said, well, even though it doesn't contain security guarantees, this is just the start, and we're working towards that. The full details aren't clear. No, you've literally just handed over all of your minerals to the US based in return for nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only absolutely nothing, but I did see a story, and this was like a rumor from Ukrainian leak channels, that essentially that Starmer had tried to get in there first and to get the mineral rights for British companies, and that this was what was behind the 100-year-long partnership that was ultimately being signed. It was Starmer trying to essentially get in there for multiple reasons before the US did, grab the resources and essentially keep Ukraine in the game with promises of $3 billion a year in perpetuity for as long as it takes. Turns out the as long as it takes was a reference to getting British companies whatever the hell he could out of Ukraine before the whole thing collapsed, it would seem. But then Trump allegedly, and again, this is from leak channels like Resident and Legitimately on Telegram. Trump found out about this, got hopping mad, and basically ordered the Ukrainians, no, you have to turn your back on this, you have to give it to us. All of which I think is going to be largely irrelevant because this regime isn't going to exist for much longer. Like if you see how the negotiations are evolving, and we'll come to this with between the US and the Russians. Like the Russians keep saying, no, it's not just Zelensky, it's the whole regime that has to go. Well, then any treaty signed between the US, the British, the French, the Germans with the Kiev regime is going to be about as valuable as like yesterday's newspaper. It's just going to be completely you can just toss it out. And so Trump can sign anything he likes with Zelensky, but if the Russian condition is no, the whole regime has to be dismantled, then there's nothing really that's going to be that Zelensky can say or do, is there?
No, no, none whatsoever. And I think as well that we've discussed this before, but one of the reasons that the British are particularly invested in trying to win back the Donbass is that in 2013, a number of British companies, such as BP, which is effectively a wing of MI6, or vice versa, depending on your perspective, they signed potentially lucrative exploitative deals with Yankovic for extraction rights in the Donbass. And obviously, those deals are all were effectively shredded after February 2022, and had been inoperable as it was for the prior ever since Maidan because of the civil war in the region. Desperately clinging on to this idea that somehow we're going to get hold of the minerals. I mean, I think it's a microcosm of Britain's wider just obsession with just keeping this going, irrespective of the costs or the any of the realities on the ground. And I think that as again we'll get into, I think that all of the European statements by European leaders, and indeed in particular Britain, but also all of the kind of maneuvers diplomatically or like from a public relations perspective, even when von der Leyen is holding a big meeting of her European family along with lots of Ukraine flags in frame, like. It doesn't mean anything because the US and Russia and potentially China are hammering out the shape of post-war Ukraine now without any reference to what the Europeans want or are saying. In fact, quite to the contrary. And I think that the US has absolutely no interest or no concern whatsoever for what the Europeans want, because they understand that the Europe is not a power of any significance whatsoever. So what? And again, to use the Afghan analogy, Trump organized the withdrawal from Afghanistan directly with the Taliban. Without and Ghani et al. Were completely cut out because why speak to the monkey when you can speak to the organ grinder?
Well, and just to say, the Trump arranged it, Biden carried it out, which means that basically it had reached consensus point within the US ruling class and the state machine. Now, there was, of course, Biden or Harris, or whoever was controlling either of these two. Would say in the election campaign, or they sort of soft pedaled Ukraine if they mentioned it at all, which means, I think, and this is pure speculation, that Trump has gone about this in one way. I think we would have seen a similar process, probably more elongated, happen if Biden had won or Harris had won, because I think it's the case that the bulk of the important players in the US ruling class had reached the point where they'd realized there was nothing more to be gained from this phase of the war. And therefore, it was too expensive. It wasn't getting them anything like what they thought. They weren't going to win. They weren't going to undermine Russia that way. So let's switch tactics and get out of the hot war and lower the risk of an actual explosion. Europe, the EU, should we say, and its constituent entities have nowhere to go. where are they going to go to replace? I mean, in theory, they could seek to replace the US as trade partner and source of and of destination of foreign direct investment with China, with Russia, with India, with I don't know, Indonesia or Malaysia, any of the other big ones from the East. But they're not going to. They're not going to do that. They are going to stick rigidly to the alliance with the United States to the bitter fucking end, because the United States basically has owned and controlled Western Europe and now Central Europe for decades now. So Trump can give them the middle finger just as Biden could, or any US president can, because there's going to be no rebellion. There's going to be no re-establishment of a strategic autonomy of the EU, because that never existed.
Yeah, and it's just, I mean, I think that recently as well that there was, like a bunch of Polish ministers, including their defense minister, they flew to DC for what was meant to be a formal extended meeting with Trump, and they got 10 minutes. Now, as someone who's traveled extensively around Poland, and you go to small kind of off the beaten path towns and cities where they have Ronald Reagan Avenue, and amongst other testaments to US imperialism, like their entire cornerstone of their national defense and much of their domestic policy as well, apart from the influence of the Catholic Church, has been about framing themselves as the US's closest ally in Europe, or one of them. And then, of course, as we've discussed before, that during the Iraq War, you had Poland and Czechia and a bunch of other Eastern and Central European states lining up to cheerlead and take part in the Iraq War, while Western Europe, with the exception of Britain, was at least publicly less keen on the idea. Now, the point is that like due to this, what can only be regarded as like a absolutely damning indictment of the Polish government from Trump's perspective. Like there was a large number of mainstream pundits and analysts who were talking about how awful this was, and Poland's the central component of Polish government strategy has been thrown into disarray as a result of this. And it's just like, I mean, how did they not see this coming? It's really quite remarkable. And then following this meeting, like Polish or non-meeting, Polish leaders are now saying, well, Zelensky should start considering suing for peace. The number of Polish soldiers and mercs and irregulars who've been killed in Ukraine is incalculable. It's probably a very large number of them. And in theory, and again, we'll get into, Poland and Germany are tasked with providing serving not only as peacekeeping forces, but they are obligated to defend against further Russian pushes towards Central and Eastern Europe. They're meant to be amassing at their borders to somehow intimidate the Russians into not advancing anymore. That role, which probably made the Poles feel very important, that's just dead in the water now. And it's quite remarkable. I might add as well that, I mean, as we'll get into, it's quite clear that and as we've discussed before, it's quite clear that slowly but surely more and more people within the NATO EU power structure are getting the memo. We've had Mark Rutte go from last year saying Ukraine's NATO path is irreversible to a few weeks back saying, oh, well, no, we never said that Ukraine would be part of NATO. We never made that pledge. It never happened.
Yeah, well, never trust a Dutch prime minister, basically. An imperialist power almost as old as Britain, and probably not quite as perfidious in terms of, the long practice trickery, but almost, and they tend to get away with it more as well. The point about Poland, I mean, the number I saw of Polish, well, out of uniform. I think the military term is sheep-dipped Polish soldiers and officers and mercenaries who had gone there was at least 10,000, maybe more. And that these were like the guys who were often deployed to like the most dangerous bits of the front line, or in some cases, they were used as basically second line troops to block the cannon fodder from retreating. And that the Poles actually regard the Ukrainians as like essentially racially inferior. And essentially the Polish soldiery behaves very much like a fascist force. And they shoot, they are alleged to have shot Ukrainian troops who are trying to retreat. They are essentially used as enforcers up and down the line, because a lot of the Ukrainians that used to do that work, like the hardcore fascist guys, they're all dead or captured or wounded. So it's a victory in itself there. But it's Poles, it's Americans, it's Brits, Frenchmen who are doing like the really dirty business of basically like forcing this barely trained army of cannon fodder to stay on the front line and get shot at. Which doesn't surprise me, is because that's like the classic role that the Brits and the Americans had in mind, which is that they sit there at the back with their guns pointing at the Ukrainians and forcing the Ukrainians to do the fighting and the dying. But what I would be curious to know, and we will only find this out in due course, is how many Poles have died in this war, and how the hell the Polish government is explaining this, how much money they're having to shovel at the various families involved to keep them quiet, and like how many Poles have the Russians captured, and what kind of deal has the Polish government had to make to get any of them back. We don't know this right now, but I imagine this is stuff I'm going to be very interested to find out come the close of this phase of the hostilities, Kip.
Yeah, and what's quite interesting is that Zelensky has called for the first step towards peace is a total trade of prisoners of war. Now, due to the habit of Ukrainians and indeed their international backers and units like the Georgian Legion, the number who routinely and ritualistically murder injured, bound, incapacitated Russian prisoners of war, and then often film themselves doing it and having a great lark doing so. I would imagine that that if Russia was to go for this, they would want some acknowledgement, because these people are in their custody, publicly by Western leaders, that there were this many French people, there were this many Brits, there were this many Americans. Like there's an enormous, throughout this conflict, I think particularly around Bakhmut, but also I've seen some more recent footage where there are first-person view cameras that mounted on soldiers, where an entire band of English-speaking troops get encircled or ambushed by the Russians, and they are absolutely bricking it, to say the least. And it's I think that in the same way that Hamas has had a number of very public hostage releases. I think this will be an opportunity for Russia to parade all of the Europeans and Americans that they've captured along the way. So yes, it will be very, very, very interesting to see. And I think also as well, I think that we've there have been reports that among the first kind of targets on Russia's list when the special military operation started were known British and American bases.
Yes.
And the mainstream media has even reported that there is a network of underground kind of tunnels in which the CIA and MI6 have operated since Maidan, which have likely been destroyed or have been taken over. Which I think that when this is all over, the Russians will be very keen to show Western journalists round.
Yes, just to point this out, as Kit says, this is from Diana Panchenko, who is an exiled Ukrainian journalist who's done a lot of work exposing like the inner workings of the Zelensky regime and how corrupt it is. The fact that Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, is essentially a gangster and what is called in Western terms a sex trafficker, or just in old-fashioned terms a fucking pimp. I don't say that in as an honorific. I don't think it should be regarded as such. So she opens this tweet by saying, 3 years ago, I woke up in Kiev to the sound of explosions. There were at least 13 American military bases and 2 British ones in Ukraine. All of them got hit in the first hours of the war. Neither the US nor Britain did a thing about it. Now, there was a report in the New York Times a while ago now, midpoint of last year, I think, Kit, that clarified the point that you've just been mentioning, which is that the CIA had, and probably still does, a network of bases inside Ukraine that they were using to operate essentially sabotage operations in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, possibly inside Russia itself. I think we can say definitely inside Russia itself, given the amount of sabotage operations that are both high profile and low profile that have been carried out across the last 3 years. It's certain that they were mapping out potential targets long before the beginning of the special military operation. And also, we know that British and American special forces have been deployed into Ukraine for the purposes that you've covered before in your reporting on the British plans for the sabotage and terrorist campaign that the people like Chris Donnelly long for, in fact, probably lie awake at night dreaming of. So is it likely, according to your best judgment on this, that the 15 bases that got hit in the first hours of the war were likely either intelligence or special forces, sort of forward operating bases inside Ukraine, which is why the Americans and the Brits basically can't admit to the fact that this happened?
Yeah, absolutely. And I might add, that I mean, it is a very striking feature of some of the leaks that we've reported on at the Grey Zone is that the British seem to have dedicated offices within various SBU headquarters, particularly in hotspots like Odessa. Like it's the Odessa SBU where with which British intelligence was carving out plans like the bombing of Kerch Bridge. So there have been a number of strikes in Odessa, which have not harmed civilian infrastructure, but have not. They've been reported as, oh, this is evil Russia attacking a defenseless city. I think that they're going after known and identified secret British and American bases. Now, I might add as well, that New York Times article that you mentioned, which acknowledged that the first thing that the head of the post-Maidan SBU did following the quote-unquote revolution. He went to after being appointed by the interim US puppet fascist government, he went to the offices of the SBU, which had basically were deserted. And the first thing he did was get on the phone to the local British and American embassies and said, send your people over here now. Right. There's another very interesting aspect of that report as well, which states that one of the reasons that Putin was encouraged to launch the special military operation was that Russian intelligence was warning him that Ukraine was being built up by the British and the Americans as a beachhead for the invasion of Russia, which people like you and I have been arguing for many, many, many years. And it was pretty much confirmed by the leaks of Institute for Statecraft Integrity Initiative documents, both organizations led by the aforementioned Chris Donnelly. That New York Times report stated, well, actually, Russian intelligence got it wrong because, in fact, the CIA was always keeping the Ukrainians somewhat at arm's length. So they were not viewing Ukraine as a potential beachhead for destabilizing or breaking up Russia. They didn't state that the British weren't possessed of this perspective or objective quite markedly. And I think that that actually to a very, 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 very large extent, for all of the US penetration and infiltration and presence in post-Maidan Ukraine, it is, as always, the British who've been really pushing for all-out war all along. And they've made little secret of it, really. It was the British who led training programs for the Ukrainian military and paramilitaries like Azov and Right Sector. The US, until Trump was successfully bounced by Russiagate into taking various hostile, belligerent stances on Russia, refused to have anything to do with these fascist militant groups, at least, formally and publicly. The CIA might be a different matter. I think that there's another reason that the British are so concerned with keeping this going is that they worry about what might be exposed in the wake of it unraveling.
Yes. Well, I mean, the British government, successive British governments have been all in on this for well over 20 years. Like, the British were all over the so-called Orange Revolution 20 years ago. The Canadians were as well, very heavily involved in that. And the reasons being that, of course, this was seen as a good way of essentially reviving British imperialism, which is fading away and needs like a massive injection of, well, blood, basically, to prop itself up for another few years. And the plan seems to have been to, again, like, massively militarize Ukraine to the point where essentially its entire adult male population could be mobilized in some kind of force that would crush, they hoped, the Donbass republics, and then they hoped to take Crimea, and then they hoped that would trigger an internal collapse within Russia, because there's a reason why that the Brits keep coming back to this, and their sympathizers inside the United States keep obsessing over Crimea. They think that if they magically manage to take that somehow, then that's the thing that will trigger the internal collapse within Russia, which is what this is really all about. Ukraine, as we have said repeatedly over a number of months now, Ukraine is the tool, the weapon by which they seek to lever the Putin system out of power in Russia itself. If Ukraine gets destroyed in the process, well, nobody in London cares. Nobody in Washington cares either, but particularly London. They don't give a shit, because this is a long cherished project, which a few 100,000 or 1 million dead Ukrainians isn't going to stand in the way of.
No, and I might add as well that as what's interesting, and again we'll get into this in due course. But like, despite the fact that the Trump administration has as good as ruled out NATO membership for Ukraine, or indeed any direct American military involvement in a post-peace settlement in Ukraine, the Starmer is still clinging to and still making public statements on a regular basis, stating that yes, that Ukraine is destined for NATO membership. Now, of course, Britain has always had an outsized leading role in NATO, and it is one of the ways that Britain, quote unquote, punches above its weight, which is to say, maintains fantasies of being a global military and diplomatic and intelligence and security power, when they are, a completely irrelevant island off the coast of Western Europe at this stage. And so, like, they have been a key driving force of NATO enlargement. As we've discussed before, and I've written about, they were heavily involved in, and if not at the forefront of efforts to get Montenegro and Macedonia and to mini statelets that used to comprise Yugoslavia into NATO. The US seemed slightly less concerned about gobbling them up, and I think in their official membership action plans that both of these countries had with NATO, it was openly acknowledged that because they are minuscule and basically don't have militaries, their role in the the military alliance is likely to be extremely limited. I mean, on the subject of mechanisms which give Britain an a heavily outsized role in international affairs, the global Five Eyes international spying network appears under threat, which the Five Eyes, for anyone who isn't aware, for whatever reason, it is the English-speaking nations, the US, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. It is a kind of global surveillance dragnet. Now, it was forged in 1947, and yes, it granted Britain a parity with the US as a leading power within this. As I reported for the Grey Zone, there was a coterie of British veteran military and intelligence people who were very, very, very pro-Brexit and pro getting Boris Johnson into Downing Street to do it, because they thought that membership of the EU threatened Britain's Five Eyes role. And that's not something that they are going to, people like Wythian Prince and Richard Dearlove are ever going to allow, or because it is a means by which these fantasies of global dominance can be maintained. However, we have had reporting in the Financial Times, which is quite extraordinary, that the White House is pushing to remove Canada from the Five Eyes intelligence group. Now, bearing in mind that Canada remains a member of the Commonwealth, and its citizens are, its head of state is King Charles, and its citizens are British subjects legally. I see this as much as an FU to Trudeau as to the British. Like, this is saying we don't need your lapdog involved in this. And I think that Trump repeatedly calling Trudeau the governor of Canada, does speak to a high degree of contempt to the US's northern neighbor. Now, whether this is going to result, as Trump has kind of on occasion kind of hinted or talked about, rambled about publicly, translates into the US wanting to annex Canada or somehow take it over, I'm not sure. But I mean, that is a huge blow. From which a large number of people, predominantly in London, will be reeling.
Well, I would say that again, this is a case of Trump in his usual style, or in the style of also his officialdom, like Navarro, whose idea apparently this is. They've revealed the relationship for what it's always been, which is that Canada is overwhelmingly dependent upon the US for trade. The British role in Canada has withered away to being largely a political one, although there is a significant amount of British investment that goes into and then out of Canada again. But the dominant force is the US. When the US president gives an order to the Canadian Prime Minister, it is followed like that. When, if you recall, the trucker protest blocked a bridge over to the US that was vital for trade, Biden picks up the phone to Trudeau and says, "You're shutting this down now," and Trudeau leapt to attention and saluted. So Trump is just looking at this, and because he and his group basically just can't be bothered with the subtleties, shall we say, anymore. Basically, they're saying, no, you're going to do exactly what we tell you to do, and we don't regard you as particularly important. You're essentially like an appendage of the US now anyway, economically speaking. You are, I mean, to quote one podcast I listened to, essentially Canada is a bunch of mining companies in an overcoat pretending to be a country. And I think that I credit the retired podcast host Jimmy Fallon Gong for that one on the Program to Chill podcast for that particular invention. Now, Trump is bringing this out into the open. As to whether he wants to annex the place or not, I doubt personally. I don't think the US ruling class would want that trouble. What they do want, though, is to basically they want the Canadian Prime Minister to acknowledge his humbled status. So when what's his name, Poilievre, if he wins the next election, he's basically promising to do just that, to essentially to grovel to Trump, to say whatever you want, sir, I will deliver it for you. You want all these Canadian resources for basically nothing? We'll give it to you. You want control militarily over everything in Canada anything they don't already possess, we'll give you that. And it would be funny in the extreme if what happened is that Trump, because of a strong showing from Mexican President Sheinbaum, basically ended up leaving Mexico alone and ended up annexing Canada basically by accident. And the funny thing is, like, the Canadians might moan a bit, but no one else would care, I don't think. London would be hopping mad, of course, because it would be essentially like a kick in the nuts for King Charles the Last. But I don't think anybody else would. Everybody else would shrug. The Chinese would say, "Well, can we carry on doing business?" And the Russians would say, "Well, that's your business." So the end of Canada, the fulfilling of the ambitions of the ultras from 1776, a potentially hilarious development. Let's see where our friend, I'm now referring to as Comrade Donald, goes with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I mean, in response, I saw a post on Twitter that made me laugh out loud, genuinely laugh out loud, which was Trudeau stated, "Well, you know, we have been by America's side consistently at the most pivotal points of their history," and someone responded, "Yeah, like when you and the British burned down the White House in 1812." So it's like, I mean, I think, yeah, there is certainly, I would say, a kind of societal level contempt or distrust of Canada in the US, at least among certain portions of the population. And I think that Trump saying the quiet part out loud, and yes, referring to Trudeau as the governor of Canada, if nothing else, it is just an ample indication of the kind of total lack of respect and contempt with which Canada is held by the US. They were the first target of Trump's tariffs and all sorts of ranting and raving about how they were allowing drugs and illegal migrants to get into the US. I mean, whether anything comes of this in the spirit, it isn't clear. But the fact that this could be expressed so openly, I think, you know, it speaks to the fact that we are in a very, very, very different world now. And the US is going to potentially operate very differently from before. Because, I mean, at least under Biden, there was the pretense of talking about our allies, even when, you know, Biden was saying, well, sadly, our allies in Europe are going to have to suck up the fact that the anti-Russian sanctions are damaging them much more than they're damaging us. But we stand by their side while they suffer and freeze to death, and you know, and their living costs become absolutely unsustainable. But yeah, in other intelligence news, the CNN has reported that there are mass layoffs in the running at the CIA. The CIA has, of course, framed this by saying, well, you know, the senior CIA officials are not only shocked at the level of the mass firings that are and buyouts that have been already offered to CIA operatives, but they've stated there's the kind of implicit threat that disgruntled former employees might be motivated to take what they know to foreign intelligence services. I mean, if that is the case, then they would be making Trump's argument that the America's alphabet soup intelligence agencies are working against American interests and have absolutely no loyalty to the US whatsoever. So this would be quite funny.
Yeah, I would just say, if there's any disgruntled CIA people watching this, you know where we are.
Yes.
Yeah, Kit has an established track record for dealing with these kind of things. If you want to make an act of principle, your final act within the US governmental structure before you leave and defect to the DPRK, then I would say we are happy to deal with anything that you want to tell us. I say, for the benefit of the MI6 people watching this program, that is a satirical comment meant to reference various different aspects of leaking and intelligence disasters over the last few years. It's not serious. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I will also note in passing that it took 4 CNN people to write what is apparently a 7-minute article, which
Yes.
given how much these people are paid, you wonder what they do all day. And my guess is reprint stuff that comes from their sources inside the CIA without any editing.
Yeah. Well, you say, their sources within the CIA. They have so many CIA people on their own payroll as pundits at this stage. They might not even need to dip into, current staffers. They can just, consult someone like John Cipher about like the lay of who endorsed the veracity of the Steele dossier and claimed that his hair turned white because of the Russians rather than getting old. But yeah, no, you joke about the potential for mass leakage. I think like Ken Klippenstein has the former Intercept journalist has stated that yes, he is being leaked an enormous amount of things by disgruntled US aid and NED people at the moment, which is superb and hopefully might contribute to freedom of information to a certain degree.
Well, yes, I think that you're probably going to get a lot of this. There's going to be a wave of pissed off US aid, CIA, NED people, basically like throwing everything out there. And what it shows, to make to go to a theoretical point for a moment, is that there is clearly a dispute within the US ruling class as to the way forward. That's been going on with increasing intensity since 2014, 15 and the first Trump run. Trump now has more backing from the US ruling class than he previously did, and that's why they're making these confident moves at the moment. But there's going to be a significant amount of pushback on this. There's going to be all kinds of chaos that will be unleashed within the United States. And what will happen is that, my guess is that Trump will end up in or Trump's administration will end up in all kinds of fights that will just simply reveal that the US is entering deeper into its decline and fall, to reference the title of our show, and that they don't know how to get out of it. There's a group now running the White House who think that they have a way forward, which is re-energize the state machine, cut all the waste, stop the expensive projects like Ukraine, focus on things that matter to as they see it. Problem is that it's not, they might be making the running at the moment, that it is by no means, they are by no means the only ones in the show. So there's going to be all kinds of chaos. You might end up with Trump triggering some sort of collapse that he didn't even mean to do, because he's pulled at too many threads that have been dangling for quite some time. And it's why essentially the meme of China just Xi Jinping, you are Xi Jinping, you sit back, you wait, you win. Because the Americans and the British basically destroy themselves. But shall we move to the potential end of Russian sanctions as another sign of this developing whirlwind here, Kit? Which
Absolutely.
is that the Russians are looking to cut a deal with the US. And it should be emphasized that the talks that the US and the Russians have been engaged in aren't necessarily all about Ukraine. In fact, much of it is not focused on Ukraine. It is focused on re-establishing communication over arms control, which the US, even in Trump's first term, didn't want to do and wasn't interested in doing. I note that they're interested in doing it now because the Russians have out-innovated them in several different areas of weapons system development, including the Oreshnik, for instance. So suddenly the US is interested in talking about this because they've been outstripped, basically. But the other point is that Trump, being again the sort of crude transactionalist that he is, the argument's being made to him about, well, why don't we develop economic relations with Russia that has a certain appeal to it? The Russians make a move by appointing this guy Dmitriev, who's worked on Wall Street, to essentially develop this further in a way, basically to cut out the Europeans and the British and to fuck with them. Knowing, and here I would just point out that we have to go back to the original Russian demands that were published at the end of 2021 to understand the nature of what's being done here. If we remember the original Russian demands, what were they? For a withdrawal of US troops to the pre-1997 border area, meaning that the Russians didn't say, we want Poland, the Baltics, etc., to leave NATO. We just want the foreign troops back to essentially Germany or Western Germany. Now, that I think is what they are trying to work towards with all of this, which is that they convince the US to essentially give them this with various enticements, including opening negotiations over US companies getting access to rare earth metals in what's now Russian territory, opening negotiations on US investment coming back into Russia, Russian investment going into the US, and essentially working around the Europeans with the idea ultimately that they can convince the US to honor that original demand, which is that by building all these relations, they can say, well, we can take this further by you withdrawing from Romania, from the Baltics, from ultimately Poland, and going back to the pre-97 borders, then we can have even better relations. That, I think, is what they're still working off that original 2021 plan, which reflects a long time, in fact, all the way back to 1999 concern of certain elements in the Russian state. So I think all of this is working back towards that original treaty that they wanted. But what's your response to this story, Keir?
Well, I mean, I think that the details of this are well worth delving into for our viewers in general, because I think number one, this was reported, I think, on the same day that the EU announced its 16th anti-Russian sanctions package, which, I kid you not, has a preponderant focus on preventing games consoles and associated gubbins entering Russia. They're particularly concerned that Russians don't have access to PlayStation controllers. So I think maybe that's what will finally bring down the court of Putin. But I think that appointing Kirill Dmitriev, who, yes, as you say, he has a background as a banker, he has a significant private sector background under Medvedev. When Medvedev was president, he was tasked with setting up a state investment fund to invest in Russia. That's one of the reasons there's been significant infrastructure and other development across the country, not just in there's a recurrent meme that, oh, well, outside Moscow and St. Petersburg, Russia is this backwards hellhole. No, there has been, and they have been steadily building up the entire country. This has actually, funnily enough, become turbocharged by the anti-Russian sanctions, because Russian oligarchs who for 20 plus years refused Putin's demands that they invest in Russia and store their money there, had to move all their money back. So, in some areas, internal investment is at record highs, and new roads and bridges and railway lines are being built, and the areas like Mariupol are being rebuilt at record speed. But also as well, I think that I'm reminded of how Trump is the only person in history to lose money from running casinos. And he was he had a large number of casinos in Atlantic City in New Jersey, and he was convinced to take on an enormous amount of debt to finance this by a business partner. Now, the individual in question, before meeting with Trump, he read The Art of the Deal to work out how to play Trump. and how to reel him in. And I suspect that the Russians may have done the same, because Dmitriev, very much his pitch to the US kind of diplomatic contingent, which included Marco Rubio, is, well, you pulling out of Russia cost you a lot of money, not only in terms of lost profits, but also Russian authorities made it very difficult for Western firms to just walk away from their liabilities. So they couldn't just abandon their offices, they couldn't just jettison their operations overnight, and they in the end extracted hundreds of billions from these companies for leaving Russia. So it's being pitched to the Americans as an opportunity to recoup what they lost. Maybe there's an opportunity for trade and investment. There's access to Russian resources, which again, the US kind of electively cut themselves off from. And per The Economist, and for The Economist to acknowledge this, it's a Ukraine Ultra publication with amongst as we mentioned, a sea of them in Britain. That for them to report this is quite significant, I think, and I think yes, it reflects the fact that above the heads of the Europeans, the Americans and the Russians are not only sculpting the shape of post-war Ukraine, but the post-war kind of financial order as well. And again, the Europeans are effectively forcing themselves into the cold on this by ratcheting up the sanctions. Yesterday, I saw that a Russian company that produces and sells uranium has started doing business with the US. So already this may be this approach may be bearing fruit. Now, I think it's important to note as well that the US, of course, has suffered as a result of the anti-Russian sanctions in terms of the quote unquote Putin price hike. The cost of basic essentials and a large number of goods have increased significantly over the past few years. Trump made this a core component of his campaign, that under Biden, your living standards have fallen and your living costs have risen, and I'm going to reverse this. This potentially offers him an easy and relatively pain-free and stress-free means of delivering that, potentially. So, I mean, and then, yes, it's the Europeans who are left to suffer. Quite remarkable.
Well, I think that if this ultimately is pulled off, if they sell this idea to Trump successfully, and if it's not blocked by Congress, which is these are big ifs, they could end up achieving like a significant amount of what they originally wanted in the SMO, basically via well, first of all, by owning the military facts on the ground. Just to dart back to that for a moment, I mean, you just shared this with me before we started, which is from Simplicity as the Thinker, which apparently shows the Russian forces like practicing for river crossings. So I mean, just to go back to what we talked about before, Kit, with regard to these Russia-American negotiations. Like, I doubt there's going to be a signing on the line of some deal about Ukraine itself. I think that what the Russians and the US are going to do is like build a whole system of other agreements and essentially just let the tires down on this thing. And if the Europeans want to basically like completely destroy the euro by essentially digitally creating gigantic amounts of euros to try and prop the Kiev regime up, then I think that the US will just let them do that, on the grounds that, well, where else are they going to go? Like, these idiots have burnt their bridges with the Chinese. Like, they are hysterical about the Russians. And so if the European Union project starts to fall to pieces, then the US is confident that these like stooge regimes in Europe aren't going to go anywhere else anyway. So if you're in Trump's position, you think, well, I'm not going to stop these people when they're basically destroying something I don't like anyway, which is like the EU, which a lot of Americans are in the ruling class circles are in two minds about anyway. So it's essentially good night Europe, good night Britain, and potentially the Russians are just going to be able to set the agenda for whatever the hell happens in the rest of Ukraine anyway by collapsing the Kiev regime and putting in place something else, which will give certain concessions to American companies in the rest of what was once Kiev regime-run territory.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that, yeah, it's important to, I think, the fact that Russia, there was a kind of a pause due, I think, or a relative pause due to very bad weather. The Russians are on the move again, and they are seizing on a pretty much daily basis more and more territory, including, very strategically significant towns and cities, and pushing the Ukrainian forces backwards and backwards and backwards. The fact that these positive, constructive talks are happening while they're doing this, and yes, indeed, it seems preparing for crossing the Dnieper River, which I saw an excellent World War II era bit of Soviet propaganda with a shattered Nazi helmet replete with swastika floating in the Dnieper, and it stated that it's lovely to cross the river in calm weather. So I think that we might be seeing a rerun of that in the near future. The fact that these apparently fruitful talk could be ongoing while the war is still happening. I think that demonstrates that from a military perspective, the US is through with this, and they have it is, as I mentioned, there is no. When we discussed the mineral deal that was cut very hastily by Zelensky, there is no suggestion that this implies further US military support. The Ukrainians think that if they bend over backwards and give Trump everything that he wants and asks for, that this will come. And yes. There is absolutely zero indication that it will, because everything that Trump officials are saying suggests the precise opposite.
Yes, exactly. And now I think it's time to do our customary check-in on the island known as Britain, perhaps not for much longer. What we generally refer to as perfidious Albion, which has been ruled over by a foul, obnoxious, obese drunkard known as Keir Starmer, allegedly, who is piloting the ship into what appears to be a whirlpool as things start to fall apart here. And this week, Starmer is engaged in an absurd attempt to brag about raising defense spending by 0.2% of GDP by 2027. So again, this just betrays like exactly what this is all about. For all the hysteria, the shouting and the screaming and the jumping up and down by the British ruling class and their pet politicians and intellectuals, and about the Putins on the march, etc., etc. Well, what are they actually doing? The truth is, raising defense spending by a small amount, relatively small amount, and they are not increasing domestic industrial capacity. They are talking about getting the defense equipment produced in India, which again, to reiterate something that we said last week, what are they going to do? They're going to ask the Russians not to sink the transport ships. It'd be awfully unsporting, chaps, if you sunk our equipment before we got it to Britain. This is a farce. They can't even pull out of this sort of parasitic way of doing business when they say they're faced with the greatest threat since the Cold War. Their behavior suggests otherwise. They're just happy to continue on in the same old way, but making a lot of noise when doing so. But what's your response to this farcical defense spending and defense review that's going on that we've talked about before? But everything that Starmer does simply confirms, I think, what we have been talking about over the last few weeks.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's like I mean, again, in the spirit of these things, because nobody takes Starmer seriously or like listens to anything that he says. I think it might be rather overlooked if or simply just our viewers may be unaware that this announcement of increased defense spending, there was an enormous amount of hype in the media
Hmm.
in the British media leading up to this, that Starmer was going to make a very, very, very substantive pledge, which was going to set the agenda for Britain's military future and its future defence strategy. And in the lead up to this, we had people like Lammy saying that, oh, actually, we need 6% of UK defense of GDP spent on quote unquote defense. There is a lot of talk about how, well, yeah, if Starmer doesn't make some very bold commitments that Britain is finished as a military power. And then in the event, in his typically wooden and kind of grating nasal beetle, kind of asthmatic beetle style, he with much fanfare, announced that spending on defense would increase to, yes, 2.5% of GDP in the next 2 years,
Hmm.
which is completely and utterly meaningless. And it comes at a time when this ongoing, you mentioned the Strategic Defence Review, already there have been cuts to in a variety of areas, and the future of things like Britain's Trident and aircraft carrier status symbols are very much questionable. So it's like, you know, it couldn't have been a more hilariously underwhelming that this is his grand plan. It doesn't address any of the issues which have been identified by official inquiries by the House of Lords. I reported on this last summer. And I think we've discussed it. There was a report that said that on lessons learned from the Ukraine war, where every single expert witness, which is usually, you know, defense apparatchiks and former top-ranking British military officials, effectively said, well, you know, we don't have the material, we don't have the stockpiles, we don't have the people, we don't have the equipment or the technology, and their only prescription for resolving this was to spend more money.
Hmm.
You know, and also, yes, like try and get the public to support this and maybe move in the direction of militarizing society by putting on paintball classes for young Britons run by British soldiers. But like, I mean, you know, it is a complete farce, and I think it speaks to like what an utterly empty vessel Starmer is, not in general, but also just by this point. And it's like, yeah, you contrast this with the actually, for all of Trump's bluster and rambling and incoherence at times, what actually amounts to, you know, very serious discussions being had in the open between the Russians and the Americans. Where are the British in all this? Oh, nowhere, because
No.
nobody takes them seriously.
Well, why would you, basically,
Yes.
is the question, because as we are looking at on the screen now, the British Army can't even get decent rifles anymore. Now, bear in mind, like the British yeah, imperialists used to have, well, talking many years ago now, a very effective small arms production base inside Britain itself. They produced like some of the most effective like small arms of the 19th and the early to middle 20th century.
Mm.
Deindustrialization does not spare the military industries, however, as does the rot that takes place inside British capitalism. So, like if you can produce something that is utter shit and still get paid hundreds of millions for it, then why wouldn't you, as a private company? Which is what they've been doing with like British military equipment for years. So now you get the story coming from the Times earlier this week about how like British sniper rifles are useless. And this isn't the first time. The standard battle rifle of the British Army, the old SA-80, was long derided as a complete piece of crap by like British allies, like mainly the Americans and other NATO countries. So They are. Starmer is like he is the naked emperor. He's threatening to send troops to Ukraine, and it's no wonder the Russians just laugh at this because what with rifles that which don't work, with troops that are untested in battle and transported on ships that don't exist. They're piloted by however many admirals the British Navy has, that are of course more than in number than the number of ships they have, with an air force that's severely diminished and increasingly reliant on the utterly crap F-35 jet. So what is Starmer's like just waving his dick around in the wind and hoping that people are impressed by this? Nobody is though.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, it's literally it's quite remarkable, and I think that as well that the we didn't get into it last week, but it bears repeating that it was reported that there was a meeting between the French and German and British discussing the potential peacekeeping operations in Ukraine. Now, Schulz stormed out because he felt that the British were effectively acting as if it was a fait accompli that this could and would happen, and that they were effectively taking orders from the British. And he is, of course, now the former German Chancellor, having been voted out by some due to a total collapse in votes for the SPD and also other members of his traffic light coalition, which will probably go down as one of the worst German governments in history, which is of course saying something. But like right around that time as well, that there was all of this talk of deploying European peacekeepers to Ukraine, which seems to have died off. There was this remarkable Reuters report, and this is from February 13th, 2025. So it is almost 2 weeks old now, but it seems to have largely passed people by. That it's got to be bearing in mind that when Schulz gave, in the wake of the SMO starting, he gave this bombastic speech, which was given blanket coverage by the Western media, about Zeitenwende, which is, it literally means historical turning point, and how the result of Russia's invasion was going to be, quote unquote, unprovoked invasion was going to be revolutionary, and it was going to change the balance of power in Europe forever, in favor of the EU and in general, and Germany in particular as its main sponsor. Now, amongst the things that that Scholz pledged openly and repeatedly was that the German military, which is viewed by many people I know in Germany as a form of kind of it's like being on welfare, except you get a uniform. It's like doesn't really exist as a military power. Reuters reported that Germany's battle readiness was actually considerably less today than it was 3 years ago. So for all of the bluster and all of the lofty pledges made by Schulz, in fact, the German army has been further hollowed out. There has been no attempt to recruit more soldiers. Most of their really significant equipment has been sent to Ukraine and destroyed already. So they're even more of a joke than before. The multiple pledges to significantly increase their number of troops have just failed to materialize, and they are in no position whatsoever to commit even a token force to a peacekeeping operation, quote unquote, in Ukraine. Now, like I mentioned that earlier, Germany is tasked by NATO with Poland with providing the bulk of the ground forces to act as first responders to an attack on the NATO's quote unquote eastern flank by Russia. Neither of these countries are in any position to do so whatsoever, at all.
No.
And I think that it's interesting, that it's interesting that that is being openly admitted in both the German and the English language media. But there's this weird almost hyper normalization in British media reporting on Starmer's insane Doctor Strangelove style belligerence, where on the one hand it's admitted that Britain's military is a joke and they're not up to the task of policing a demilitarized zone or whatnot, or preventing further Russian advances by token of their presence. But then there's also still an enormous amount of hype about nothing.
Yeah.
It's very, very strange.
Well, I think the thing is that they've got used to the idea that essentially that they can govern by hype, that they can essentially just keep things going by like making big announcements and by moving large amounts of totally fictitious money around, and that this will do in terms of actual rather than actually anything concrete going on. And when they actually have to do something, they find themselves having no capacity to do it. Key example of which is like the long cherished idea that certain British governments, going back to David Cameron, that they were going to revitalize the British nuclear industry. Now, this was talked about and talked about and talked about. Of course, the British ruling class had run down the nuclear industry in this country for decades beforehand when they saw it as having outlived its usefulness. It had been useful to pressure and ultimately help to destroy the mining industry. Once that had been done, they basically just fucked it off. Too expensive, too costly, and too low a profit margins to operate. Then they panicked and realized that they actually might need to generate some of their own energy. So they started talking about reinvesting in it again. The initial idea was that a lot of this investment was going to come from China. That's what George Osborne kept going over there to try and negotiate. The Chinese were up for it. Then, of course, the Americans told them no. So then it was going to be a partnership with the French, which didn't work out because even though the French have more of a nuclear industry than the Brits do, it's still not exactly in a healthy state. So now they're saying that, well, we're going to do it ourselves, going to pay for it all. My guess is that they won't, because the skill base needed to do this has disappeared. The British don't have it anymore. The BNFL, British Nuclear Fuels, has long since been transformed into a private company and bitten the dust. The skill base needed to construct and maintain large-scale nuclear power operations, I think, is diminished. It would take them years to rebuild it, and the British ruling class don't like investing in long-term things. So they're going to try and buy the expertise in and elsewhere at great cost, at enormous delays to the project, which won't deliver what they said it would anyway. So this is like end stage imperialism, absorbing gigantic amounts of money, producing very little, and basically being revealed as posing no threat really to Russia, to China, to anybody. And consequently, as we've already mentioned, the Americans look at this and go, well, why the hell should we bother with you?
Yeah, and it's. I mean, on the subject of nuclear energy as well, I might add that the collapse of the Green vote, particularly among young voters, was very beautiful to see, because the Greens, in a very competitive category, have distinguished themselves as perhaps the single worst political party in Western Europe. From a mainstream perspective, they excluding out and out fascist parties, that they
that's a close run thing with the Greens.
Yeah, indeed. And it's like the Greens, they stated that when Schulz was forming his traffic light coalition, they said the one thing we will not budge on is the closure of all Germany's nuclear power plants, but not only the closure, the destruction thereof. And there was a large number of prominent Green Party supporters and Green Party politicians who, when footage emerged of Germany's nuclear power plants, which were already kind of been left to rot a bit, really, were being demolished, they were cheering this So it's like you had, yeah, France likewise has drastically reduced its nuclear industry. Its engineers have moved elsewhere into other industries, or indeed to other countries that aren't quite so masochistic and idiotic. And so yeah, that like I mean, Macron, the other day gave this speech about how well, there's a need for now, quite clearly, because of Trump turning away from Europe, for Europe to start investing in itself, to have some degree of a high degree of autonomy. And we need to make our own technology. We need to have our own industries. We need to reinvigorate sectors, both public and private, that we kind of ignored for many decades. And it's like, well, but how are you going to do this?
Hmm.
Like, it's going to take generations.
Yeah.
And this is while you were also cutting yourself off from China, which would be the absolute best means of you, and provide the quickest means of you being able to do this.
Hmm. Well,
So yeah, it's end stage imperialism writ large, where it's like,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's like something out of a Thomas Pynchon novel or something, where it's like, the architects of their own demise are now wondering, well, no, are now whining, saying nobody told us this would happen.
Well,
Like,
I hate to break it to Emmanuel Macron, but Lenin told you it would happen all the way back in 1916. But a dumb motherfucker like Emmanuel Macron would never have read that. Like, it's literally like building castles in the sky stuff. It's like, well, if we do this and this, we can revive our industry, revive our technology base.
mm,
It's like these people don't understand even how they built that up in the first place and how long it's been in decline. I mean, like Macron, who is probably more intelligent than Starmer, which I don't think would be particularly hard.
no,
Um,
not competitive. Not
no.
competitive.
Then again, I think there's single-celled organisms which are more intelligent than Keir Starmer. Like these people have no conception of how rotten the system they are running truly is. And I want to just go to this story that you shared with me from The Guardian from last Monday, which is that British businesses are considering the biggest layoffs in a decade, because the picture there sums it up, which is that for a lot of like city centre developments now in this country, the whole idea was that this was going to be a knowledge economy and a leisure society. This has been something that's been pushed by many British politicians for decades. But of course, with a population that has no money, that has no disposable income, where's the leisure society? It doesn't exist. And so all of the explosion in particularly like pub, restaurant, etc. businesses that have grown up over the last 2 decades, it's all now going because there simply isn't the customer base for it anymore, which is something which is incredibly predictable. But again, nobody told the geniuses at the Treasury that this was on the cards. And so another decline is going to come. Like this recession that is here now is not a new one. It's been here perpetually since 2008. So this is the latest unfolding stage in a crisis, which is going to see British imperialism further diminish itself. And I keep talking about this, but in my own program, but my fellow residents of Perfidious Albion really need to realize that the ruling class not only doesn't have a plan, like that, their only conception of how to proceed is to try and continue in the same old way. That's what they're going to try and do. And if that means like the entire country gets, sunk into the Atlantic Ocean, that is what they will do. So here we are, crisis time.
Yeah. I mean, I think just on this point as well. I mean, it is quite good timing for this to happen when the military the British military is in desperate need of new recruits, and I gather I've heard from several people that they have noticed an uptick in advertising for the British Army. In a friend of mine in the UK said every other advert in on TV is a recruitment marketing for the military. But it's like, yeah, I just think that this is the natural endpoint of a series of decisions made by successive British governments a very long, in decades past, which was massive. I mean, of course, starting with perhaps the Callaghan government, but particularly by Thatcher, and then by her successors, her adopted sons Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, which was they thought that yes, that Britain would have a quote unquote knowledge economy, and that would be culture would be our primary export, and we wouldn't have to make anything because we have a strong currency, and that means we can import everything. And that had the obvious benefit of neutralizing the political and economic power of Britain's working class. But this is the boomerang: is that eventually everyone suffers. And yes, as you state, Britain has been in a state of perpetual recession and economic decline since 2008. It's just the number of people affected is growing, and it's working its way up from the poorest, ever more increasingly up through the quote unquote middle classes, the bourgeois, and people. A large number of people who thought that they were doing well out of the system. What comes next, I'm not sure. Apart from maybe Wes Streeting replacing Starmer and then carrying on doing the same things. So that's something to look forward to.
Yes, we will be here to cover that when Wes ultimately staggers into office and then is ejected from it a few years later. Replaced by either Prime Minister Farage or somebody else who can be a bit more respectable on the international stage, perhaps. But I think the optimistic note I would sound here is that even an attempt to impose fascism in this country is going to be tremendously difficult for them without an industrial base. Because they don't have one. They don't produce much of anything at all. And so if you're going to try and reinvigorate British imperialism by bringing in some kind of fascist regime, well, good luck with that when you don't produce jack shit. Like at least the Nazis or the Italian fascists or even the Spanish fascists had something of a base to work off. British fascism would literally be like some City of London guys cosplaying in SS uniforms on the weekend, which we know, guys, you all do anyway, so don't pretend otherwise. And it would be like it would be a theatre of the absurd. Not that it wouldn't be dangerous. I don't wish to dismiss the murderous nature of these people, because they are dangerous. But in terms of being able to actually revive British imperialism, it would be an absolute fucking non-starter. The first thing a British fascist regime would end up having to do is probably to grovel to the Chinese. Now,
yes.
As much as Javier Milei has done, who we don't have time to cover this week, but I will note in passing that if you elect a crypto con man as your president, or will have one imposed upon you, don't be surprised if he launches his own scam coin. Perhaps more on that next week. But it's an apt moment, Kit, to turn to our next story, which is, of course, that for all the hype that the Chinese and the Russians are falling out with each other, the Americans are dividing them again. Like, turns out neither the Chinese nor the rulers of Russia are that stupid. The Russians might want to get a deal with the Americans, but they're sure as hell not going to trust them again. And the Chinese and the Russians are engaged in a much longer term plan than any of the rulers of the US or the European countries or the perfidious British could possibly conceive. And that they know damn well that a deal that's signed by Donald Trump with either of them could easily disappear when the next criminal moves into the White House. But your response to the Western media getting it wrong about the Russian and Chinese partnership yet again?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I just this. I mean, I think that this is quite this kind of positive and amusing note to end on, which is
Mm.
that like yeah, for a very long, ever since the media actually kind of got caught wind of the existence of this of the no limits Russian and Chinese partnership. Which I mean, if you go over the details, and this was signed at the start of February 2022. It is really quite extraordinary, and its terms made very clear that Russia and China were in this for the long haul. And there was all sorts of components of it in terms of like cultural sharing, in terms of teaching Russian in Chinese schools, and vice versa, because it's important that the Russians and the Chinese can communicate with each other effectively. And knowing that the Chinese are always planning decades in advance. This was a really bold statement of investment in the bond between these two countries. Now, it seemingly went over the heads of Western pundits, and indeed Western policymakers in every regard. There was a 2022 Pentagon National Defense Strategy report, which didn't even mention this, or the fact that it their partnership by definition meant if you go to war with Russia or you go to war with China, you're at war with both of them. And in fact, actually now you're probably at war with Iran by default as well as and other countries. Now, when the media finally kind of got to grips with the fact that this agreement and this partnership existed on a formal basis, they then did their usual thing of trying to undermine it via various narratives. And so a recurring claim, which I think Moon of Alabama collated all of like the kind of dozens of different mainstream articles that stated this as fact. It was Russia's the junior partner in this. They're like they're effectively a Chinese vassal. It was effectively trying to diminish Russia as a kind of afterthought for the Chinese, and somehow the vastly inferior subjugated member of this quote unquote partnership, which is just obviously not the case for a variety of reasons. And in recent months, I have noticed that there have been again because of for a while there was that period where they were claiming that China is responsible for the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're like they're because of their economic and military relationship with Russia, and like there was a lot of talk about how Xi seems to be having buyer's remorse. He's stepping away from this. His statements are not as effusive as Putin's in talking about this, and this is a subtle indication that they are moving away from this partnership. And no, we fast forward to today, and Xi has issued a very firm statement, and that he and China are totally committed to this no limits partnership, and that this is going to continue and it's going to ever deepen. And so, I mean, I think that if the US strategy, which, as some has posited, is to try and get Russia on side in order to isolate China or undermine China. That's not going to happen. It just isn't. And also, there's as well. I might add that when Trump's been has made noises about a significant mutual reduction in defense spending, and has referred to Xi in kind of positive terms. I actually don't think that's the overall strategy at all. I don't think that the US is trying to divide Russia and China, because, I mean, they would probably like to, but they understand that this is impossible. You're not
Yes.
going to I mean, Mike Pompeo got caught by those two Russian pranksters who seeming, always managed to hoodwink EU and US officials into believing that they're someone else and making extraordinary disclosures. Like Mike Pompeo stated, well, where we got it wrong with Russia was we didn't do enough to try and integrate them into the Western fold, and that's what we should do. That's what we should be focused on now, pushing them away from China and reintegrating them into the West economically and politically, etc. I mean, after 3 decades of being insulted, ignored, every red line broken, every possible insult, direct and indirect from Western leaders towards Russia, they're not going to be immediate. They're not going to be like, oh, what were we arguing about anyway? Like, they're like, that's not going to happen at this stage. And so, I mean, along with, like Marco Rubio's referring to how, well, we live in this multipolar world now, and that's just a reality, unipolarity is over. I mean, even if it's begrudging, and even if there are elements within the power structure who remain committed to trying to cause havoc in Russia and China, or trying to turn them against each other, or fomenting a major conflict with Beijing over Taiwan, say. I actually have a quite high degree of optimism that it's kind of understood that this is all just fantasy, and that the US has to get to grips with the fact that that its international might and is greatly and irreversibly truncated at this stage, and it has to deal with the fact that Russia and China, whether they like it or not, are major powers with the ability to assert themselves economically and militarily. And so it is overall a smarter option, even just from the perspective of hard-nosed realpolitik, just to not provoke them and try and have some kind of constructive dialogue with them. And I think I made this point on a previous broadcast as well, that the aid pause has led a number of kind of targeted US enemy states, in particular Iran, to Iranian leaders view the cessation of State Department meddling in their country as the potential dawn of new constructive relations with the US. It's like, well, no, we can actually talk like adults with you without you messing with us. Despite the legal challenges and certain revisions to what aid is frozen, I don't think there is no indication, indeed quite the reverse, that all of these destabilization programs are going to be resumed. Like, I think that they're just going to wither. They're going to wither and die. I mean, I've spoken about my personal experience on being on the ground in Serbia, where many the US aid and NED and other Western US primarily foundations have infiltrated civil society, the media and politics, the judiciary. There is a large number of organizations locally which have shut down. They have cut most of their staff. They have instituted pay cuts of up to 70% in order to just keep going. There have been desperate calls for the EU to plug the gap. And what has the EU done? Oh, it's cut its own foreign development assistance budget. And Britain, has one of the ways it's going to pay in a time of austerity for its minuscule increase in defense spending is by cutting its aid budget. So
fucked.
So I just think that, like, such as for all of the gnashing rhetoric emanating from the Baltics and Brussels and London, I do think that just due to sheer geopolitical gravity, people are going to fall in line because they don't actually really have much choice.
Yeah, because these programs are now blown, and there's not going to be much there to replace them. It's the 90s have finally ended. I think it's fair to say. Oh God, it was an awful fucking decade. Do not try and bring this back in some kind of revival. We were there. It wasn't that good the first time round.
Yeah.
So, Kit, I think that brings us towards a conclusion for today.
A negotiated closure.
Negotiated closure to the 1990s, which could not have come, which should have come a lot sooner. This has been your episode of Decline and Fall for this week. Look out for the audio version on Spotify. Look out for the program notes, which will be going up on the Substack page. And look out for a dedicated YouTube channel coming very soon as we develop this platform even further. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in. Be sure to like and to share this program wherever you can. We want to get the word out as far and as wide as possible. But it only remains for me to say thank you to my comrade and friend, Kit Clarenberg, for joining me today for this latest episode. Thank you, Kit.
Right back at you, comrade Alex. I just to echo what Alex said, thank you so much for joining us. We are going to be launching this as a standalone project with its own YouTube channel, its own Rumble channel, its own Twitter or X, depending. And we're very excited about that, and we look forward to you joining us. So see you next week, guys. Take care.
Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said his